Good morning. Uh, Today we're going to be looking at a passage of scripture from Exodus that talks about the Israelites as they were wandering through the desert wilderness and they had run out of food. We're going to title the lesson, What's for Dinner? Well, for several years, I volunteered at the Boiling Springs Community Center administering practice tests and helping students prepare for the GED, the Graduate Equivalency Diploma for high school. Throughout the day, there would be a procession of people in the hallways looking for someone to help them with the paperwork for relief or support programs. Many would be in tears because of their levels of frustration. But regardless, they would be offered bags of food and articles of clothing to take back to their families. The local school district recently sold the old elementary school property where the community center was located. And in a board meeting, the former verbal agreement to provide another building to house the center was rescinded. Supposedly, the district will provide some property if the center can raise the funds to build on the site. The GED classes will no longer be a part of that program. Food donations from local families are still helping provide assistance, but obstacles are hindering the mission ministry. The Spartanburg Soup Kitchen has encountered a different kind of problem. Local building projects and renovations in the downtown area have moved many of the people who sought meals or assistance there. During the COVID outbreak, many meals were delivered to homes or areas where people would have access. And there's still a need for volunteer drivers or for people to help with food preparation and packing the meals. The people with needs still remain, although they may not be as visible as they were a few years ago. For most of us, it may be difficult to imagine being in a situation where we're desperate for food. We may recall some times during our childhood when we had to economize or do without certain foods, but we may not be able to remember a day when there was no food and there seemed to be no relief in sight. After fleeing from the oppressive Egyptian rulers in a land where they were living as slaves, the Israelites began to turn away from God. They had seen His power when the Egyptians suffered plagues as they were protected and when they were spared from the advancing Egyptian forces that were attempting to kill or recapture them. But when the threat no longer was present, they neglected or turned away from God. In today's lesson, we move forward with the Israelites as they experience consequences for their shallow faith. They're wandering in the desert and their food supplies have run out. I'm going to read Exodus 16th chapter, verses 2 through 19, and then verses 31 and 32. The whole Israelite community complained against Moses and Aaron in the desert. The Israelites said to them, "Oh, how we wish that the Lord had just put us to death while we were still in the land of Egypt. There we could sit by the pots cooking meat and eat our fill of bread. Instead, you brought us out into this desert to starve this whole assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to make bread rain down from the sky for you. The people will go out each day and gather just enough for that day. In this way, I'll test them to see whether or not they follow my instruction. On the sixth day, when they measure out what they have collected, it will be twice as much as they collected on other days." So Moses and Aaron said to the Israelites, "This evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the Lord's glorious presence, because your complaints against the Lord have been heard." "Who are we? Why blame us?" Moses continued. "The Lord will give you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord heard the complaints you made against Him. Who are we? Your complaints aren't against us, but against the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, say to the whole Israelite community, come near to the Lord, because he's heard your complaints. As Aaron spoke to the whole Israelite community, they turned to look toward the desert, and just then the glorious presence of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses, I've heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will have your fill of bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. In the evening, a flock of quail flew down and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew all around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the desert surface were thin flakes, as thin as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? They didn't know what it was. Moses said to them, this is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Collect as much of it as each of you can, 1 omer per person. You may collect for the number of people in your household. The Israelites did as Moses said, some collecting more, some less. But when they measured it out by the omer, the ones who had collected more had nothing left over, and the ones who had collected less had no shortage. Everyone collected just as much as they could eat. Moses then said to them, don't keep any of it until morning. The Israelite people called it manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and tasted like honey wafers. Moses said, this is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept safe for future generations, so they can see the food that I used to feed you in the desert when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Have you ever noticed a situation where people's mistakes began piling up, and instead of accepting blame, they turn on the guy in charge? That's what happened when the Israelites began to forget their relationship with God. And when troubles began to mount, they blamed their leaders for their problems. They were in the desert. The food supplies were gone. And instead of looking at their neglected responsibilities, they blamed Moses and Aaron. Even being a slave in Egypt, there was food to eat. Why couldn't Moses have just stayed out of their lives? Why offer them hope and then allow them to stray from their moral principles and their heritage of Judaism? It was evident that God had failed them. Moses, of course, realized that God had not turned his back on the Israelites. They had turned away from him. But as Moses sought God's guidance, God provided a way forward. How could they find enough food in a desert to provide for a mighty nation? God shared with Moses a plan to save his people. Each morning, bread would rain down from the sky, and the people would be allowed to gather enough for that day. But on the 6th day of the week, they would receive a double amount, because they would not gather bread on the Sabbath, as it was a day to be devoted to worship. Moses then directed Aaron to assure the people that God had heard their complaints. But he also pointed out that the complaints were essentially about God, because Moses and Aaron were merely liaisons to share God's message to them. He also reinforced the idea that God would still provide for them, even though they had lapsed in their faith and in their worship. Then Moses asked Aaron to tell the people to come near the Lord. This statement may be symbolic, as many were failing, and so this was merely addressing where the assembly should take place. But it also was to show the presence of God still in their lives. Remember that the presence of God was hidden from their sight in a cloud that had led them on their journey. But the statement also could mean the group needed to re-examine their personal relationship and realize they had not been steadfast followers. When the group turned to look toward the desert, the glorious presence of the Lord appeared in the cloud. Then the answer from God in response to their complaint was shared by Moses after God told him that at twilight they would eat meat, and in the morning there would be bread for them, reaffirming that their Lord was still providing for them. That evening, a flock of quail appeared, providing enough meat for the entire group. And later, when the morning dew lifted, thin frost-like flakes covered the ground. When the people questioned what it was, Moses told them that it was the bread that had been promised. They were instructed to gather an omer, about 1.5 quarts, for each person in their household. This amount could sustain them through each day, and they could anticipate the same amount each morning of a new day. The Israelites called the bread manna and said it tasted like honey wafers. 1 omer was to be kept for the future, to be shown to later generations and prove to them that God had continued to provide for his people when they had been brought out of Egypt. The Israelites would continue wandering on their journey to get to a land overflowing with milk and honey. But along the way, they would have to be reminded that people chosen by God to represent him have an obligation to accept his love and mercy by living a life that honors him. Turning away from God and falling prey to temptation brings consequences. We, like the wandering Israelites, are going to face problems. Like them, we may ask, why me? But perhaps we can be encouraged by the words of Paul in Colossians 1:24. Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake. Paul was showing that because in his sufferings he reached the end of his own ability and was forced to really trust in God. He also believed that his suffering better enabled him to minister, because there were other people who were suffering. And the third reason was that his suffering would never compare with the glory that God was preparing for him. Someone once said that often the pay we initially receive in trying to follow the example of Christ may not seem that good. There's so much adversity and so many problems, but the retirement plan is spectacular. Suffering sometimes makes us better appreciate what the future will bring, because we deepen our faith, gain strength, and move beyond our current problems and frustrations. I don't think I've ever been on a mission trip where there was not some kind of snag or problem at the onset. But once we worked together through prayer and common effort, we could find our way. The Israelites first rediscovered the presence of God in their lives. Then he provided the manna and quail that sustained them on their journey. Today, we live in a land of plenty, but some children in the state in which we live are going hungry. While there are food banks and programs that exist, the adults who should be seeking these resources may not be responsible enough to do so. In previous years, schools provided free breakfast and lunch programs, but recently in many districts, funds were curtailed or redirected to supplement fees for private education for wealthy constituents who voted for and contributed to political campaigns. It seems that we may need to reword our Pledge of Allegiance. Can we be one nation under God, indivisible, that provides life and liberty for all? Are we now a nation that ignores God, is divided by social class and race, and provides life and liberty for some? The Israelites had to re-examine their lives and to realize that God still loved them and would provide for them. They simply had to trust and have faith that he would lead them forward. Jesus tells us that we show our love for God by the way we love one another. God continues to love us. We need to allow God to guide us by sharing that love with others we meet along the way. Let's pray together. Dear God, thank you for your love for us, for providing us strength when we face adversity, and for allowing us to serve you as we share your love with others.